The War in the Air. The Epilogue. It happened that one bright summer's morning, exactly 30 years after the launching of the first German air fleet, an old man took a small boy to look for a missing hen through the ruins of Bun Hill and out towards the splintered pinnacles of the Crystal Palace. He was not a very old man. He was, as a matter of fact, still within a few weeks of 63, but constant stooping over spades and forks and the carrying of roots and manure and exposure to the damps of life in the open air without a change of clothing had bent him into the form of a sickle. Moreover, he had lost most of his teeth, and that had affected his digestion, and through that his skin and temper. In face and expression he was curiously like that old Thomas Smallways, who had once been coachman to Sir Peter Bone. And this was just as it should be, for he was Tom Smallways the son, who formerly kept the little greengrocer's shop under the straddle of the monorail viaduct in the high street of Bun Hill. But now there were no greengrocers' shops, and Tom was living in one of the derelict villas hard by that unoccupied building site that had been, and was still, the scene of his daily horticulture. He and his wife lived upstairs, and in the drawing and dining rooms, which had each French windows opening on the lawn. And all about the ground floor generally, Jessica, who was now a lean and lined and baldish, but still very efficient and energetic old woman, kept her 3 cows and a multitude of gawky hens. These two were part of a little community of stragglers and returned fugitives, perhaps 150 souls of them altogether, that had settled down to the new conditions of things after the panic and famine and pestilence that followed in the wake of the war. They had come back from strange refuges and hiding places, and had squatted down among the familiar houses and begun that hard struggle against nature for food which was now the chief interest of their lives. They were by sheer preoccupation with that a peaceful people, more particularly after Wilkes, the house agent, driven by some obsolete dream of acquisition, had been drowned in the pool by the ruined gasworks for making inquiries into title and displaying a litigious turn of mind. He had not been murdered, you understand, but the people had carried an exemplary ducking 10 minutes or so beyond its healthy limits. This little community had returned from its original habits of suburban parasitism to what no doubt had been the normal life of humanity for nearly immemorial years. A life of homely economies in the most intimate contact with cows and hens and patches of ground. A life that breathes and exhales the scent of cows, and finds the need for stimulants satisfied by the activity of the bacteria and vermin it engenders. Such had been the life of the European peasant from the dawn of history to the beginning of the scientific era. So it was the large majority of the people of Asia and Africa had always been wont to live. For a time it had seemed that, by virtue of machines and scientific civilization, Europe was to be lifted out of this perpetual round of animal drudgery, and that America was to evade it very largely from the outset. And with the smash of the high and dangerous and splendid edifice of mechanical civilization that had arisen so marvellously, back to the land came the common man, back to the manure. The little communities, still haunted by 10,000 memories of a greater state, gathered and developed almost tacitly a customary law and fell under the guidance of a medicine man or a priest. The world rediscovered religion and the need of something to hold its communities together. At Bun Hill this function was entrusted to an old Baptist minister. He taught a simple but adequate faith. In his teaching, a good principle called the Word fought perpetually against a diabolical female influence called the Scarlet Woman. and an evil being called alcohol. This alcohol had long since become a purely spiritualized conception deprived of any element of material application. It had no relation to the occasional finds of whisky and wine in Londoners' cellars that gave Bun Hill its only holidays. He taught this doctrine on Sundays, and on weekdays he was an amiable and kindly old man, distinguished by his quaint disposition to wash his hands, and if possible his face, daily, and with a wonderful genius for cutting up pigs. He held his Sunday services in the old church in the Beckenham Road, and then the countryside came out in a curious reminiscence of the urban dress of Edwardian times. All the men without exception wore frock coats, top hats, and white shirts, though many had no boots. Tom was particularly distinguished on these occasions because he wore a top hat with gold lace about it, and a green coat and trousers that he had found upon a skeleton in the basement of the Urban and District Bank. The women, even Jessica, came in jackets and immense hats extravagantly trimmed with artificial flowers and exotic birds' feathers, of which there were abundant supplies in the shops to the north. And the children? There were not many children, because a large proportion of the babies born in Bun Hill died in a few days' time of inexplicable maladies, had similar clothes cut down to accommodate them. Even Stringer's little grandson of 4 wore a large top hat. That was the Sunday costume of the Bun Hill district, a curious and interesting survival of the genteel traditions of the scientific age. On a weekday the folk were dingily and curiously hung about with dirty rags of housecloth, and scarlet flannel, sacking, curtain serge, and patches of old carpet, and went either barefooted or on rude wooden sandals. These people, the reader must understand, were an urban population sunken back to the state of barbaric peasantry, and so without any of the simple arts a barbaric peasantry would possess. In many ways they were curiously degenerate and incompetent. They had lost any idea of making textiles. They could hardly make up clothes when they had material, and they were forced to plunder the continually dwindling supplies of the ruins about them for cover. All the simple arts they had ever known they had lost, and with the breakdown of modern drainage, modern water supply, shopping, and the like, their civilized methods were useless. Their cooking was worse than primitive. It was a feeble muddling with food over food fires in rusty drawing-room fireplaces. For the kitcheners burnt too much. Among them all no sense of baking or brewing or metalworking was to be found. Their employment of sacking and such like coarse material for workaday clothing, and their habit of tying it on with string and of thrusting wadding and straw inside it for warmth, gave these people an odd, packed appearance. And as it was a weekday when Tom took his little nephew for the hen-seeking excursion, so it was they were attired. "So you've really got to Bun Hill at last, Teddy?" said old Tom, beginning to talk and slackening his pace so soon as they were out of range of old Jessica. "You're the last of Bert's boys for me to see." "What I've seen, young Bert, I've seen, Sissy and Matt, Tom, what's called after me, and Peter. The traveller people brought you along all right, eh?" "I managed," said Teddy, who was a dry little boy. "Didn't want to eat you on the way?" "They was all right," said Teddy. "And on the way near Liverhead I saw a man riding on a bicycle." "My word," said Tom. "There ain't many of those about nowadays. Where was he going?" "Said he was going to Dorking if the high road was good enough. But I doubt if he got there. All about Burford it was flooded. We came over the hill, uncle. What they call the Roman road. That's high and safe." "Don't know it," said old Tom. "But a bicycle? You sure it was a bicycle? Had 2 wheels?" "It was a bicycle right enough." Why, I remember a time, Teddy, where there was bicycles no end. When you could stand just here. The road was as smooth as a board then, and see 20 or 30 coming and going at the same time. Bicycles and moti-bicycles, moti-cars, all sorts of whirly things. No, said Teddy. I do. They'd keep on going by all day, hundreds and hundreds. But where was they all going? Asked Teddy. Tearing off to Brighton. You've never seen Brighton, I expect. It's down by the sea. Used to be a most amazing place, and coming and going from London. Why? They did. But why? Lord knows why, Teddy. They did. Then, you see that great thing there, like a great big rusty nail sticking up higher than all the houses, and that one yonder, and that, and how something's fell in between them among the houses? They was parts of the monorail. They went down to Brighton too, and all day and night there was people going, great cars as big as houses, full of people. The little boy regarded the rusty evidences across the narrow, muddy ditch of cow droppings that had once been a high street. He was clearly disposed to be sceptical, and yet there the ruins were. He grappled with ideas beyond the strength of his imagination. What did they go for? He asked. All of them. They had to. Everything was on the go in those days. Everything. Yes, but where did they come from? All round here, Teddy. There was people living in those houses, and up the road more houses and more people. You'd hardly believe me, Teddy, but it's Bible truth. You can go on that way forever and ever, and keep on coming on houses, and more. There's no end to 'em. No end. They get bigger and bigger. His voice dropped as though he named strange names. It's London, he said. And it's all empty now and left alone. All day it's left alone. You don't find hardly a man. You won't find nothing but dogs and cats after the rats, until you get round by Bromley and Beckenham. And there you find the Kentish men, herding swine. Nice rough lot they are too. I tell you that so long as the sun is up, it's as still as the grave. I've been about by day, orphan and orphan. He paused. And all those houses and streets and ways used to be full of people before the war in the air, and the famine, and the Purple Death. They used to be full of people, Teddy, and then came a time when they was full of corpses, when you couldn't go a mile that way before the stink of 'em drove you back. It was the Purple Death had killed 'em, every one. The cats and dogs and hens and vermin caught it. Everything and everyone had it. Just a few of us happened to live. I pulled through, and your aunt, though it made her lose her hair. Why, you find the skeletons in the houses now. This way, we've been into all the houses, and took what we wanted, and buried most of the people, but up that way, Norwood way, there's houses with the glass in the windows still, and the furniture not touched, all dusty and fallen to pieces. And the bones of the people lying, some in bed, some about the house, just as the Purple Death left 'em 25 years ago. I went into one, me and old Higgins, last year, and there was a room with books, Teddy. You know what I mean by books, Teddy? I seen 'em with pictures. Well, books all round, Teddy. Hundreds of books, beyond rhyme or reason, as the saying goes. Green, mouldy, and dry. I was for leaving 'em alone. I was never much for reading. But old Higgins, he must touch 'em. I believe I could read one of 'em now, he says. Not it, I says. I could, he says, laughing, and takes one out and opens it. I looked, and there, Teddy, was a coloured picture. Oh, so lovely. It was a picture of women and serpents in a garden. I never see anything like it. This suits me, said old Higgins, to rights. And then, kind of friendly, he gave the book a pat. Old Tom Smallways paused impressively. And then? Said Teddy. It all fell to dust. White dust. He became still more impressive. We didn't touch no more of them books that day. Not after that. For a long time both were silent. Then Tom, playing with a subject that attracted him with a fatal fascination, repeated, All day long they lie, still as the grave. Teddy took the point at last. Don't they lie o' nights? He asked. Old Tom shook his head. Nobody knows, boy, nobody knows. But what could they do? Nobody knows. Nobody ain't seen to tell not nobody. Nobody? They tell tales, said old Tom. They tell tales, but there ain't no believin' 'em. I gets home about sundown and keeps indoors, so I can't say nothin', can I? But there's them that thinks some things and them as thinks others. I've heard it's unlucky to take clothes off of 'em unless they got white bones. They're stories. The boy watched his uncle sharply. What stories? He said. Stories of moonlight nights and things walking about. But I take no stock in 'em. I keeps in bed. If you listen to stories, Lord, you'll get afraid of yourself in a field at midday. The little boy looked around and ceased his questions for a space. They say there's a og man in Beckenham what was lost in London 3 days and 3 nights. He went up after whisky to Cheapside and lost his way among the ruins and wandered. 3 days and 3 nights he wandered about, and the streets kept changing so he couldn't get home. If he hadn't remembered some words out of the Bible, he might have been there now. All day he went, and all night. And all day long it was still. It was as still as death all day long, until the sunset came, and the twilight thickened, and then it began to rustle and whisper, and go pit-a-pat with a sound like hurrying feet. He paused. Yes? Said the little boy breathlessly. Go on, what then? A sound of carts and horses there was, and a sound of cabs and omnibuses, and then a sort of whistling, shrill whistles, whistles that froze his marrow. And directly the whistles began, things begun to show. People in the streets hurrying, people in the houses and shops busying themselves, motor cars in the streets, a sort of moonlight in all the lamps and windows. People, I say, Teddy, but they wasn't people. They was the ghosts of them that was overtook, the ghosts of them that used to crowd those streets. And they went past him and through him, and never heeded him, went by like fogs and vapours, Teddy. And sometimes they was cheerful, and sometimes they was horrible beyond words. And once he come to a place called Piccadilly, Teddy, and there was lights blazing like daylight, and ladies and gentlemen in splendid clothes crowding the pavement, and taxi-cabs following along the road. And as he looked, they all went evil in the face, Teddy. And it seemed to him, suddenly they saw him, and the women began to look at him, and say things to him, horrible wicked things. One come very near him, Teddy, right up to him, and looked into his face, close. And she hadn't got a face to look with, only a painted skull. And then he see, they was all painted skulls. And one after another they crowded on him saying horrible things, and catching at him and threatening and coaxing him, so that his heart near left his body for fear. Yes, gasped Teddy, with an unendurable pause. Then it was he remembered the words of Scripture, and saved himself alive. The Lord is my helper, he says, therefore I will fear nothing. And straight away there came a cock crowing, and the street was empty from end to end. And after that the Lord was good to him and guided him home. Teddy stared and called out another question. But who was the people? He asked. Who lived in all these houses? What was they? Gentlemen in business, people with money. Leastways, we thought it was money, till everything smashed up. And then, seemingly, it was just paper. All sorts. Why, there was hundreds and thousands of them. There was millions. I've seen that I Street there regular so's you couldn't walk along the pavements, shopping time, with women and people shopping. But where'd they get their food and things? Bought 'em in shops, like I used to have. I'll show you the place, Teddy, if we go back. People nowadays haven't no idea of a shop. No idea. Plate glass windows, it's all Greek to them. Why, I've had as much as 1.5 tons of potatoes to handle all at one time. You'd open your eyes till they dropped out to see just what I used to have in my shop. Baskets of pears heaped up, marrers, apples and pears, delicious great nuts. His voice became luscious. Bananas, oranges. What's bananas? Asked the boy. And oranges. Fruits they was, sweet, juicy, delicious fruits, foreign fruits. They bought 'em from Spain and New York and places, in ships and things. They brought 'em to me from all over the world. And I sold 'em in my shop. I sold 'em, Teddy. Me what goes about now with you, dressed up in old sacks and looking for lost 'uns. People used to come into my shop, great beautiful ladies like you'd hardly dream of now, dressed up to the nines, and say, "Well, Mr. Smallways, what you got s'morning?" And I'd say, "Well, I got some very nice Canadian apples, or p'raps I got custard marrers. See?" And they'd buy 'em. Right off they'd say, "Send me some up." Lord, what a life that was. The business of it, the bustle, the smart things you saw, motor cars going by, carriages, people, organ grinders, German bands. Always something going past, always. If it wasn't for those empty houses, I'd think it all a dream. But what killed all the people, Uncle? Asked Teddy. It was a smash-up, said old Tom. Everything was going right until they started that war. Everything was going like clockwork. Everybody was busy and everybody was happy, and everybody got a good square meal every day. He met incredulous eyes. Everybody, he said firmly. If you couldn't get it anywhere else, you could get it in the workhouse. A nice hot bowl of soup called skilly, and bread better than anyone knows. How to make now? Regular white bread, government bread. Teddy marvelled, but said nothing. It made him feel deep longings that he found it wisest to fight down. For a time the old man resigned himself to the pleasures of gustatory reminiscence. His lips moved. "Pickled salmon," he whispered, "and vinegar, Dutch cheese, beer, a pipe of tobacco." "But how did the people get killed?" asked Teddy presently. "There was the war. The war was the beginning of it. The war banged and flummocked about, but it didn't really kill many people, but it upset things. They came and set fire to London and burnt and sank all the ships there used to be in the Thames. We could see the smoke and steam for weeks. And they threw a bomb into the Crystal Palace and made a bust-up, and broke down the rail lines and things like that. But as for killing people, it was just accidental if they did. They killed each other more. There was a great fight all hereabout one day, Teddy, up in the air. Great things, bigger than 50 houses, bigger than the Crystal Palace, bigger than anything, flying about 'em in the air and whacking at each other and dead men falling off 'em. Terrific! But it wasn't so much the people they killed as the business they stopped. There wasn't any business doing, Teddy. There wasn't any money about, and nothing to buy if you had it. But how did the people get killed? Said the little boy in the pause. I'm telling you, Teddy, said the old man. It was the stopping of business come next. Suddenly there didn't seem to be any money. There was cheques. They was a bit of paper written on, and they was just as good as money, just as good, if they come from customers you knew. Then all of a sudden, they wasn't. I was left with 3 of them, and 2 I'd given change. Then it got about that £5 notes were no good, and then the silver sort of went off. Gold you couldn't get for love or anything. The banks in London had got it, and the banks was all smashed up. Everybody went bankrupt. Everybody was thrown out of work. Everybody. He paused and scrutinised his hearer. The small boy's intelligent face expressed hopeless perplexity. That's how it happened, said old Tom. He sought for some means of expression. It was like stopping a clock, he said. Things were quiet for a bit, deadly quiet, except for the airships fighting about in the sky, and then people began to get excited. I remember my last customer, the very last customer that ever I had. He was a Mr. Moses Gluckstein, a city gent, and very pleasant, and fond of sparrowgrass and chokes. And he cut in. There hadn't been no customers for days, and began to talk very fast, offering me for anything I had, anything, potatoes or anything. Its weight in gold. He said it was a little speculation he wanted to try. He said it was a sort of bet, really, and very likely he'd lose. But never mind that, he wanted to try. He always had been a gambler, he said. He said I'd only got to weigh it out, and he'd give me his cheque right away. Well, that led to a bit of an argument. Perfectly respectful it was, but an argument about whether a cheque was still good, and while he was explaining, there came by a lot of these here unemployed with a great banner they had for everyone to read. Everyone could read those days. We want food. 3 or 4 of them suddenly turns and comes into my shop. Got any food? Says one. No, I says. Not to sell, I wish I had. But if I had, I'm afraid I couldn't let you have it. This gent, he's been offering me... Mr. Gluckstein, he tried to stop me, but it was too late. What's he been offering you? Says a great big chap with a hatchet. What's he been offering you? I had to tell. Boys, he said, here's another financier. And they took him out there and then and hung him on a lamppost down the street. He never lifted a finger to resist. After I told him, he never said a word. Tom meditated for a space. First chap I ever seen hung, he said. How old was you? Asked Teddy. About 30, said old Tom. Why, I saw 3 pig stealers hung before I was 6, said Teddy. Father took me because of my birthday being near, said I ought to be blooded. Well, you never saw no one killed by a motor car anyhow, said old Tom after a moment of chagrin. And you never saw no dead men carried into a chemist's shop. Teddy's momentary triumph faded. No, he said, I haven't. Nor won't. Nor won't. You'll never see the things I've seen, never. Not if you live to be 100. Well, as I was saying, that's how the famine and rioting began. Then there was strikes and socialism, things I never did hold with, worse and worse. There was fighting and shooting down, and burning and plundering. They broke up the banks up in London and got the gold, but they couldn't make food out of gold. How did we get on? Well, we kept quiet. We didn't interfere with no one, and no one didn't interfere with us. We had some old taters about, but mostly we lived on rats. Ours was an old house full of rats, and the famine never seemed to bother 'em. Often we got a rat, often. But most of the people who lived hereabouts was too tender-stomached for rats. Didn't seem to fancy 'em. They'd been used to all sorts of falals, and they didn't take to honest feeding, not till it was too late. Died, rather. It was the famine began to kill people. Even before the Purple Death came along, they was dying like flies at the end of the summer. How I remember it all. I was one of the first to have it. I was out, seeing if I mightn't get hold of a cat or something, and then I went round to my bit of ground to see whether I couldn't get up some young turnips I'd forgot. And I was took something awful. You've no idea the pain, Teddy. It doubled me up pretty near. I just lay down by that there corner, and your aunt came along to look for me and dragged me home like a sack. I'd never have got it better if it hadn't been for your aunt. Tom, she says to me, you got to get well. And I had to. Then she sickened. She sickened, but there ain't much dying about your aunt. Law, she says, as if I'd leave you to go muddling along alone. That's what she says. She's got a tongue, as your aunt, but it took her hair off. And asked though I might, she's never cared for the wig I got her, off the old lady what was in the vicarish garden. Well, this here Purple Death, it just wiped people out, Teddy. You couldn't bury 'em, and it took the dogs and the cats too, and the rats and horses. At last every house and garden was full of dead bodies. London way. You couldn't go for the smell of 'em. And we'd had to move out of the High Street into that villa we got. And all the water run short that way. The drains and underground tunnels took it. God knows where the Purple Death come from. Some say one thing and some another. Some said it come from eating rats and some from eating nothing. Some say the Asiatics brought it from some high place. Tibet, I think, where it never did nobody much harm. All I know is it come after the famine, and the famine come after the panic, and the panic come after the war. Teddy thought. What made the Purple Death? He asked. Haven't I told you? But why did they have a panic? They had it. But why did they start the war? They couldn't stop themselves. Having them airships made 'em. And how did the war end? Lord knows if it's ended, boy, said old Tom. Lord knows if it's ended. There's been travellers through here. There was a chap only 2 summers ago. Say it's going on still. They say there's bands of people up north who keep on with it. And people in Germany and China and America and places. He said they still got flying machines and gas and things. But we haven't seen nothing in the air now for 7 years. And nobody hasn't come nigh of us. Last we saw was a crumpled sort of airship going away. Over there. It was a littleish sized thing, and lopsided as though it had something the matter with it. He pointed, and came to a stop at a gap in the fence, the vestiges of the old fence from which, in the company of his neighbour Mr. Stringer the milkman, he had once watched the South of England Aero Club's Saturday afternoon ascents. Dim memories, it may be, of that particular afternoon returned to him. There, down there, where all that rust looks so red and bright, that's the gasworks. What's gas? Asked the little boy. Oh, a hairy sort of nothing, what you put in balloons to make 'em go up. And you used to burn it till the electricity come. The little boy tried vainly to imagine gas on the basis of these particulars. Then his thoughts reverted to a previous topic. But why didn't they end the war? Obstinacy. Everybody was getting hurt, but everybody was hurting, and everybody was high-spirited and patriotic, so they smashed up things instead. They just went on smashing. and afterwards they just got desperate and savage." "It ought to have ended," said the little boy. "It didn't ought to have begun," said old Tom. "But people was proud. People was la-di-da-ish and uppish and proud. Too much meat and drink they had. Give in? Not them. And after a bit nobody asked 'em to give in. Nobody asked 'em." He sucked his old gums thoughtfully, and his gaze strayed away across the valley to where the shattered glass of the Crystal Palace glittered in the sun. A dim, large sense of waste and irrevocable lost opportunities pervaded his mind. He repeated his ultimate judgment upon all these things obstinately, slowly, and conclusively, his final saying upon the matter. "You can say what you like," he said. "It didn't ought ever to have begun." He said it simply. Somebody, somewhere, ought to have stopped something, but who or how or why were all beyond his ken.